Is Bethesda's game engine outdated? Should they update it? The answer may come as a shock. No, their engine isn't nearly as outdated as you probably think, and even if it were, updating it would probably cause more problems than it would solve. What's up guys, Acerthorn here, and welcome to another video game industry discussion video. I do these analysis and discussion videos on a regular basis, so if you'd like to see more of them, hit that subscribe button to stay notified. Nearly everywhere you go, even those who love Bethesda believe that Bethesda's engine is severely outdated. More importantly, a lot of people argue that Bethesda's stubborn refusal to update their game engine is the primary reason why so many of their games are so littered with glitches and bugs. People seem to think that if they just started using a more up-to-date engine, the game would suddenly become a lot more stable. I am not here today to argue for or against the argument that Bethesda should update their engine solely because they should be keeping up with the game engine trends. That argument is entirely subjective and, quite frankly, is willfully ignoring the technical aspects of game design that updating one's engine would likely invoke. No, today I'd like to argue that there is a 99.99% chance that Bethesda updating their engine would have little to no impact on the quality or stability of their games, would be a complete waste of money anyway, and would in fact most likely lead to more problems. So asking them to update their game engine simply for the sake of updating it would be akin to switching from Windows to Linux and all the learning curves that go with such a switch. Let me ask you, do you even know what exactly a game engine is? Because if you don't know that, then what the fuck makes you think you have any business judging whether their game engine is outdated or whether updating it would solve more problems than it would cause? Sheesh! Kotaku.com provides us with a brief rundown of what exactly a game engine actually is. Basically, it's some lines of raw code that are reused from one game to the next. That's it. That's honestly all it is. So you know how the console command player.addItem will add certain items to the player's inventory, and how that console command has been used consistently for that purpose all the way from Oblivion to Fallout 4? Well, guess what? That's basically part of the game's engine. So if Bethesda were to give the people what they think they want and start fresh with a new engine from the ground up, literally everything, even the most basic of game code foundations, would have to be redesigned from the ground up. You honestly think that wouldn't cause more problems than it would solve? There are plenty of games that reuse many of the same aspects and metadata, but still offer a wide variety of varying concepts and ideas, limited more by developer imagination than the actual game engine itself. I know the term asset flip, the recycling of graphical assets from one game to the next, and sometimes even outright ripping off graphical assets from completely independent IPs, is often used in a pejorative sense nowadays, often being equated to developer laziness. But is asset flippage really inherently bad for game design? Games that are accused of being asset flips as an insult usually have quite a lot of other problems besides just their recycled graphics. I personally feel that the recycling of old game data, including graphics or even engines, can be a good thing so long as it's used productively. Imagine if the time and money saved on the asset flippage was instead dedicated to focusing on things about the game world that are actually going to be new. The recycled game data from a game engine works the exact same way. It has a negligible effect on game stability. In fact, Bethesda does indeed update their game engine. considering that all a game engine is just the base lines of code that are reused from one game to the next. It honestly should go without saying that Bethesda technically has a new engine with every game, as each game will necessarily build off ideas from the last. Just because they used the Creation family of game engines doesn't mean that they are using the same engine any more so than you using the Windows family of operating systems means that Windows 10 is the exact same operating system as Windows 95. So what exactly can we expect to happen if Bethesda were to give people what they think they want and actually start anew with a new engine? Let's assume they don't just code their own brand new engine from scratch, but instead get a license for a pre-existing engine such as the latest Unreal Engine. Do you honestly think that the bug problems would improve? The Elder Scrolls series has a very different franchise than anything else on the market at the moment. It has various processing and memory demands that almost no other video game franchise in history has ever bothered to deal with. For example, whenever you save your game, you aren't just saving the player's spot in the game map and how far along you are on each quest. You are saving a variety of little things that the vast majority of games on the market today wouldn't even consider. For example, in the player homes, you have the freedom to place any object you want, literally anywhere you want. Want to place a cheese wheel on top of the end table, and then place a silver candlestick on top of that cheese wheel? Go right ahead. If that's your thing, then you can decorate your house that way. Because player homes do not respawn, that means that we can leave our player homes unattended for as long as we want, weeks or even years in-game, and when we return, that cheese wheel and candlestick will still be in the exact same spot you left it, not even so much as rotated by 10 degrees, let alone have its position completely reset. That certainly isn't something the game developers could possibly have accounted for when programming the game, yet the game still must keep track of it, and more importantly, the game must keep track of these things even when those cells are not actively loaded at the moment. This is the sort of thing that gives the Elder Scrolls series the unparalleled sense of immersion that it has, but it's also the sort of ultra nitpicky thing that most commercially available game engines simply aren't programmed to keep track of. It might keep track of a few seemingly inconsequential things like that for a little while, but after enough time has passed, or after enough inconsequential actions have been stored, most game engines will delete this data from the game's inventory in order to free up memory and processing power for tasks that, and let's be completely fair here, are honestly going to be considered more important in 99.9999998% of other game franchises. That is just one of the many aspects of Bethesda's open-world RPGs that modern game engines simply aren't designed to take into account. So if Bethesda were to simply capitulate to the will of uninformed fans and get a more modern game engine because reasons, one of two things would most likely happen. Either the Elder Scrolls games would have to have their player freedom and sense of immersion greatly scaled back in order to fit inside the confines of this new engine, or the engine itself would have to be deconstructed and rebuilt from the ground up in order to accommodate the unique demands of the Elder Scrolls games. If they did the latter, then we would, in all likelihood, be faced with the exact same problem we are currently facing, the game engine being heavily stretched and twisted in a way it wasn't designed for. So as you can clearly see from this example, the age of the engine has hardly any appreciable impact on the game's stability. And from here, we can see the real source of the problem when it comes to Bethesda's bugs. The problem isn't the result of their outdated engine. The problem is the result of the massive scope of Bethesda's game worlds, the non-linearity of each game, and the unparalleled level of player freedom. These three factors combined make the Elder Scrolls games what they are, but they also mean that Bethesda cannot possibly account for literally every single itty-bitty thing that a player may want to do and have the ability to do in the game. At best, developers can sometimes account for players doing various stages of quests in a unique order. For example, stealing from the Mages Guild to advance a Thieves Guild quest after the player has already joined the Mages Guild and can risk expulsion thereof. Okay, let's make it so that stealing the Arrow of Extrication doesn't get you expelled from the Mages Guild. Fair enough. However, considering that Elder Scrolls games often have literally hundreds of quests, each of which have literally dozens of quest stages, that means that accounting for literally every possible combination of quest stages that the player could possibly be at the moment is simply impossible. And all of that isn't even beginning to consider the butterfly effect that can be caused by seemingly insignificant actions by the player, such as stealing someone's candlestick so that you can place it on top of your cheese wheel inside your home. This also means that identifying the source of each individual bug and patching it accordingly is often a lot easier said than done. Because of the vast multitude of player actions that can possibly influence the game in an unintended way, actually identifying what the player did along the way that triggered this bug is often quite a colossal challenge. Often, the only way the source of the glitch can be uncovered and patched is when the bug is caused by only a handful of triggers, and when the bug happens 100% of the time when those triggers are met. Sometimes the player's autonomy in these games can have unintended consequences, but other times the game can glitch up entirely independent of any player input. This is, once again, the result of the game's massive and complex world. Sometimes, automatic processes such as NPC scripts may cross paths with one another and interact with one another. Just like with the player actions, Bethesda cannot possibly account for literally every possible combination of instances when the game scripts are interacting with one another. That's just never going to happen. These bugs are often even harder to find the source for and subsequently patch because we can't even rely on the player remembering what he or she did in the game up to that point. And often, the glitch being caused may not even become apparent until much, much later in the game. The most famous example of this happening in a Bethesda game has to be Oblivion's Radiant AI, which Bethesda had to drastically scale back before release because it actually worked so well that the rest of the game world couldn't keep up with it. Entire villages would be killed off because nearby bears would be searching for prey to kill. Shops would have their inventories depleted because NPCs came in and bought all the inventory. Guards would be scheduled to eat food, but wouldn't have any food in their inventory, so they would abandon their posts to go and find food, only to be killed by other guards for the crime of abandoning their post. The list goes on and on, so as you can clearly see, even when the player doesn't actively participate in the game, even when the game is left entirely to its own devices, a game this massive and this complex is going to interact with itself in ways the game developers can never possibly anticipate. Asking games of this scale to not have bugs is like asking a country of more than 300 million people to not have criminals. Now, take all of the various complications I just mentioned, both in regards to the player's actions and the game world interacting with itself, all of the ways the game may not flow the way the developers intended, and now multiply those complications by 1,000,000 times. That's basically what we have in multiplayer games like Fallout 76. There are literally thousands of people playing online along with you at any one point in time. Each one of them is interacting with the game world in an infinite number of unpredictable ways. While their quest logs may be separate from your own, they are still playing inside the same game world as you, and that world is meant to exist 24/7 in perpetuity. In most other multiplayer games where matches usually only last a few minutes, game maps are reset each time a new match is loaded, and the events of each match do not influence the other outside of player ranking systems. So anytime somebody else manages to bug the game to your detriment, its effects are often only temporarily felt. But Bethesda's multiplayer worlds, like Elder Scrolls Online and Fallout 76, are meant to exist persistently. This means that your game can become glitched up, not by your own inadvertent actions, but by the actions of other players as well. These other players may not even be acting maliciously. Some of them certainly are, this is the internet after all, but other times it may just be other human players having the best of intentions, but interacting with the game world in the most subtle of ways that even they may not be fully aware of, which can have a butterfly effect on your gaming experience. So as you can see, the game engine, least of all how outdated the game engine actually is hardly the biggest source of Bethesda's numerous bugs. Rather, the biggest source of all these bugs is the things that cause us to love Bethesda games despite all of the bugs, the massive, non-linear, and immersive game worlds. If you need one final piece of evidence that the game engine isn't the problem when it comes to Bethesda's unstable and borderline broken games, you need look no further than the other aspect of Elder Scrolls and Fallout games that make these games a cut above the rest: the extensive modding community. Specifically, the unofficial patches that so often dominate the list of mods when sorted by most popular. Think about it. These mods obviously use the same game engine as the vanilla games, because duh. So if the outdated game engine was the thing that was causing these bugs in the first place, why would these patches usually be so effective at removing the bugs? Yeah, that's a bit of a toughie, isn't it? You'd think that if the game engine was the thing that was making these bugs inevitable, there wouldn't be a whole lot that modders could do to solve the problem short of modding in a new engine, not simply releasing bug fixes in the form of a patch. Now, one could argue that the presence of these unofficial patches and how effective they typically are at removing so many of these bugs just goes to show that the massive scope of the game world, the complexity of the game scripts, and the mass degree of player autonomy doesn't actually make the bugs quite as inevitable as I described a moment ago. This, in turn, means that all the bugs that exist in the games at launch really are Bethesda's fault after all. Bethesda could make more stable games if they wanted to, so why don't they? That may be true. However, this video is not meant to defend Bethesda on that front. This video is meant to debunk the common misconception that Bethesda's game engine is outdated, and that this outdated engine is often the source of many technical woes with Bethesda games. If Bethesda's games are buggy, it's because Bethesda just sucks at bug fixing, not because the game engine is outdated. This is what really pisses me off about Bethesda's haters. As I demonstrated in my video from a couple of months ago, why Bethesda isn't actually becoming EA with sources, so many common criticisms are either blatant double standards or are outright misguided. Well, in this instance, you have a perfectly valid criticism against Bethesda practically gift-wrapped for you, the fact that they are incompetent at patching bugs, and yet you choose to point the finger of blame at their game engine, despite there not being even the slightest scintilla of evidence to prove that the game engine is actually the culprit. Gee, it's almost like you guys actively don't want to be taken seriously as critics. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. In 4 different ways, I have effectively crushed the rumor that Bethesda's outdated game engine actually matters in any meaningful or tangible way. You can argue that Bethesda should update their engine simply because their current engine is out of fashion, and that Bethesda should keep up with the trends. But that is an entirely subjective argument. So can we all please, pretty please, stop acting like Bethesda's game's technical woes are caused even partially by the game engine, because quite frankly I'm sick of hearing it. And with that, I bid you all adieu. Acer Thorin out. Peace!